Story 1. That night started like any other. Exhausted from a long day at work, I crawled into bed, setting my alarm for 7 a.m. out of habit. I even double-checked it. I couldn't afford to be late for an important meeting the next morning. Satisfied, I placed my phone on the nightstand, turned off the light, and let sleep take me. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the blinds, far brighter than it should have been. Groggy and disoriented, I reached for my phone, ready to hit snooze. But the screen read 10 a.m. My stomach dropped. I bolted upright, panic setting in as I realized I had overslept. Frantically, I checked the alarm settings, expecting to see what went wrong. To my shock, there was no alarm set, none at all. Had I forgotten? That didn't make sense. I remembered setting it, even double-checking it. My mind scrambled for answers. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe I'd somehow turned it off in my sleep. The uncertainty left me uneasy as I rushed through my morning routine, skipping breakfast in a desperate attempt to salvage what I could of the day. But something about the way I woke up haunted me. It wasn't just the missing alarm, it was how wrong I felt, like I hadn't had proper sleep at all. Groggy, unfocused, I stumbled through the day, unable to shake the unease. During lunch, I grabbed my phone and combed through the settings again, searching for updates, changes, anything. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Still, the thought of the missing alarm nagged at me like a shadow just out of reach. That evening, I decided to test my phone. I set a timer. It went off without a hitch. I set a dummy alarm. It rang exactly when it should. Reassured, I told myself it must have been a one-time glitch. Before bed, I set my alarm for 7 a.m. again, this time adding a backup alarm on an old clock I hadn't used in years. Satisfied I'd covered all bases, I went to bed. But I couldn't shake the dread as I drifted to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the blaring sound of my old clock. I grabbed my phone, expecting to silence its alarm, but there was none. Again. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. No alarm. No trace of one. Yet I knew I had set it, just as clearly as I remembered setting it the night before. A deep unease settled over me. Could someone have tampered with my phone? The thought seemed absurd, but I couldn't dismiss it. I lived alone in a locked apartment. How could anyone else be involved? That night, I decided to take extra precautions. I locked every door and window, even wedging a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I reset my phone, hoping to fix any potential glitches, and set the alarm again. This time, I placed the phone in a drawer, far from reach. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something, or someone, was interfering. As I lay in bed, unease gripped me tightly. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke to the old clock's alarm again. My heart sank as I opened the drawer. It was slightly ajar, though I had closed it tightly the night before. Inside, my phone lay with its screen on, displaying the home screen. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The alarm was gone, as though it had never existed. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. In desperation, I checked the footage from the small security camera I had installed near my apartment door. I'd put it there months ago after a string of neighborhood break-ins. But as I reviewed the footage, my stomach twisted. There was no sign of anyone entering or leaving my apartment during the night. That night, I made a decision. I would stay awake and see what was happening. I set the alarm as usual, placed my phone on the nightstand, and lay in bed pretending to sleep. Hours passed in tense silence. Just as my eyelids began to droop, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible click. It was the sound of a button being pressed. My eyes snapped open, and I bolted upright. I grabbed my phone, but it was too late. The alarm was gone again, and the screen was blank. My heart thundered as I scanned the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But I was alone. Or so it seemed. That was the last night I trusted my phone. I switched to using a manual alarm clock and stopped relying on digital devices for anything critical. But the unease never left me. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was in my apartment, tampering with my alarms. And the most terrifying part? I still don't know why. Story 2. The dream was vivid, too vivid. I stood in the front yard of my childhood home, watching as flames devoured it. The heat was suffocating, and the air was alive with the sound of wood cracking and collapsing into ash. Desperation gripped me as I tried to run toward the house, to save something, anything, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like I was wading through quicksand, powerless to stop the inferno. All I could do was watch as the house crumbled to nothing before my eyes. When I woke, my body was drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself, though the dread lingered. The house was fine, or so I assumed. I hadn't been back there in years, not since my parents sold it and moved away. Still, the dream weighed on me, pressing against my chest like a dark omen. Later that morning, I went out to check the mailbox. Among the usual stack of bills and junk mail was an envelope that immediately caught my attention. It was plain, unmarked, with no return address, and the edges were charred, as if it had been pulled from a fire. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, its faint smell of smoke clawing at my senses. The message was brief, cryptic, and chilling. It wasn't a dream. I stared at the words, the paper shaking in my grip. There was no signature, no hint of who had sent it, or why. But the burned edges and smoky scent were too eerily similar to the dream to be a coincidence. Someone knew. Someone had to know. The rest of the day was a blur of unease. I tried to distract myself, but the dream and the letter gnawed at the edges of my mind. By evening, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. I called my parents, hoping they might have some explanation, something to ground me. When my mom answered, her voice was warm but tinged with surprise. I didn't call often. I asked if she'd heard anything unusual about the old house. She paused, her tone shifting. She said she hadn't thought about the house in years, but a few weeks ago, a neighbor had called her. They'd seen someone lurking around the property late at night. My mom had brushed it off as nothing at the time, but hearing about the letter made her voice tremble. She told me to be careful and let her know if I learned anything more. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames, felt the suffocating heat, and smelled the acrid smoke. The dream felt less like a product of my subconscious and more like a warning. The letter only deepened my sense of unease. Someone was trying to tell me something. But what? The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to see the house for myself. It was a few hours' drive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was waiting for me there. As I approached the neighborhood, a wave of nostalgia hit me, memories of riding bikes with friends, playing in the yard, my dad's booming laugh echoing through the halls. But as I turned onto the street, a deep unease replaced the warmth of those memories. The house looked wrong. It had aged far more than it should have. The windows were dark, the lawn overgrown, the entire property radiating an air of abandonment. I parked across the street, my heart pounding as I stared at the house. Finally, I stepped out of the car and approached the front door, half expecting someone, or something, to stop me. The door was unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of smoke hit me, thick and acrid, as if the fire from my dream had come to life. The interior was eerily familiar but coated in a thin layer of dust, the furniture long gone. I moved through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached my old bedroom, I froze. The walls were blackened, and the floor was scattered with ashes. The fire had been real, at least here. My chest tightened as I bent down to sift through the debris, my fingers brushing against something solid. It was a small, charred box. Inside, I found a stack of old photographs. Most were of my family, but some were unfamiliar. One in particular made my blood run cold, a man standing in front of the house, his face obscured. I didn't recognize him, but something about him felt wrong. On the back of the photo was a date, the day after I had the dream. Clutching the box, I left the house in a daze. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the upstairs window and froze. A figure stood there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, but when I looked again, it was gone. I drove home in a haze, the box of photos on the seat beside me. That night, I spread the photos out on my table, studying each one. The man appeared in several, always near the house but never inside it. Who was he? And why did he seem tied to all of this? That night, I dreamed of the house again. This time, there were no flames. Instead, the man from the photo stood in the doorway, staring at me. His face was still obscured, but I could feel his eyes, cold and unrelenting. I woke with a start, my heart racing. When I went to check the mailbox that morning, there was another envelope waiting for me. Unlike the first, this one was pristine. Inside was a single sentence that sent a chill through my very soul. "We're not finished." Story 3. I first realized someone had moved into the apartment next door late one evening. It started with the muffled scrape of boxes being dragged across the floor and the occasional thud of furniture being set in place. Odd, I thought. The apartment had been empty for months, and I hadn't seen anyone come or go. The hallway was always quiet, but now faint noises filtered through the walls, signaling the presence of a new tenant. At first, I didn't think much of it. People moved in and out of the building all the time, and I figured I'd eventually run into them. Days passed, though, and the activity next door seemed to fizzle out. I never saw anyone in the hallway. There was no unfamiliar car in the lot, no sounds of conversation or music, just the occasional faint footsteps in the dead of night. Then the mail began arriving. It started innocently enough, a plain envelope, addressed to me. No return address. I opened it out of habit, only to find a generic welcome packet from a furniture store addressed to someone named Daniel. Confused, I double-checked the envelope. My name and apartment number were scrawled neatly on the front, a perfect match. The next day, a small package arrived. Again, my name was on the label, but inside was a book with a handwritten note tucked between the pages. "Enjoy this, Daniel." I stared at the note, unease prickling at the edges of my mind. Whoever had sent the package thought I was Daniel, or perhaps Daniel had used my name and address. I taped a polite note to the package and left it outside the door next to mine. When I checked later, the package was gone, but I hadn't heard anyone open the door or seen anyone take it. The mail kept coming. Letters, packages, even a postcard, all addressed to me but clearly intended for Daniel. It felt like I was being drawn into someone else's life, like I was a character in a story I didn't understand. I thought about knocking on their door to clear things up, but something held me back. The silence from that apartment felt heavy, as though it were listening. Then came the photograph. One evening, I arrived home to find a large package outside my door. The label was the same, my name, my apartment number. Inside was an old, framed photograph of a family I didn't recognize. The edges of the photo were worn, and the people in it stared out with expressions that felt unnervingly alive. I quickly set the package aside, telling myself I'd leave it at Daniel's door in the morning. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photograph, the faces staring out at me, the silence next door. Around midnight, a soft tapping began on the wall that separated our apartments. It was rhythmic. Deliberate. Not a knock on the door, on the wall. I sat frozen in bed, listening as the tapping continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating. I told myself it was nothing, pipes, maybe, or the wind, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I gathered all the mail and packages meant for Daniel and knocked on my neighbor's door. I waited, the pile of items in my hands growing heavier with each passing second. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, explaining the situation. Still nothing. Frustrated, I left the mail outside their door and went about my day. When I returned that evening, the mail was gone. But so was the nameplate on their door. Where it had once read, Apartment 2B, it was now blank, just an empty slot, as though no one lived there at all. I went to the building manager the next day, desperate for answers. I explained everything, the mail, the packages, the strange noises, the silence. The manager gave me a confused look and said the apartment had been vacant for months. No one had rented it. There was no Daniel. My blood ran cold. If no one lived there, who had been making the noises? Who had taken the mail and packages? And why had they all been addressed to me? That night, the tapping returned. Louder. More insistent. It wasn't just tapping anymore, it was deliberate, almost angry, as though something on the other side of the wall was demanding my attention. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart pounding, and whispered, "Daniel. Is that you?" The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a faint, chilling laugh. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through me like a blade. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had packed a bag and called a friend, begging for a place to stay. I left the apartment without looking back, but the weight of the unanswered questions followed me like a shadow. The mail stopped coming after I left. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear faint tapping on the walls, soft, rhythmic, deliberate, reminding me of the neighbor who never was. Story 4. When I parked my car that evening, I was certain I had locked it. I distinctly remembered pressing the button on my key fob and hearing the reassuring chirp of the locks engaging. The street was quiet, cloaked in the shadows of trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Feeling secure, I went inside and didn't give it another thought, until the next morning. As I approached my car, a strange unease settled over me. Something was off. The driver's seat was reclined slightly, different from how I'd left it. My stomach churned as I opened the door. The contents of the glove compartment were strewn across the passenger seat, papers, receipts, random items scattered as if someone had rummaged through them. My heart pounded as I surveyed the mess, half expecting to discover something missing. But nothing was gone. My wallet, foolishly left in the center console, was untouched. Even the spare change in the cup holder remained. It was as though someone had gone through my things but decided not to take anything. The realization was disorienting, almost more unsettling than if something had been stolen. I stood there, trying to convince myself I had forgotten to lock the car. But I knew I hadn't. The thought that someone had been inside my car while I slept just feet away made my skin crawl. Vulnerability seeped into me like a cold wind. I checked the exterior of the car, searching for signs of forced entry, but there were none, no scratches, no broken glass, nothing to suggest how they'd gotten in. It was as though they had simply walked up, opened the door, and helped themselves to my space. Then I noticed it. Tucked neatly into the cup holder was a small piece of paper, folded once. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it, expecting to see some kind of message. But it was blank. No writing. No markings. Just an empty piece of paper. Yet it felt deliberate, a silent message meant to unnerve me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. Maybe they'd seen me park the car, noticed my routine, and waited for the perfect moment. I scanned the quiet street nervously, but there was no one. Just the rustling trees and the distant hum of traffic. I called a friend, hoping they could offer some reassurance. They suggested it was a harmless prank or random curiosity, but their tone betrayed unease. They urged me to be careful, to double-check my locks, to stay alert. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the sequence of events, spinning questions I couldn't answer. Why had they gone through my car? What were they looking for? Had they found it? The thought of someone invading my space, touching my belongings, made my chest tighten with dread. The following morning, I took every precaution. I cleared out my car, removed anything that might catch a stranger's attention, and checked the locks obsessively. But the feeling lingered, that gnawing sense of exposure, of being watched. A few days later, another sign. As I walked toward my car, faint smudges on the driver's side window caught my eye. Fingerprints. Too faint to be certain, but they hadn't been there before. My breath hitched as I stared at them, another quiet reminder that someone had been there. I considered calling the police, but what could I say? Nothing had been stolen, and there was no damage. Would they even take me seriously? Instead, I installed a small camera near the driveway, desperate for answers, or at least some peace of mind. The first few nights, I checked the footage obsessively. Nothing. Just the stillness of the neighborhood under the blanket of night. But on the fourth night, at 2 a.m., I saw it. A shadowy figure at the edge of the frame. They didn't approach the car, didn't linger long. They just stood there, watching. Then, without a sound, they melted back into the darkness. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been there. Watching. Waiting. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt exposed, powerless, furious. The camera had confirmed my fears, but it hadn't answered the burning questions. Who were they? What did they want? In the weeks that followed, I lived in a state of constant vigilance. I checked the locks on my car and home repeatedly, looked over my shoulder, scanned the street for anything unusual. The figure never reappeared, at least, not that I could see, but their presence lingered like a shadow over my life. Every time I approached my car, I hesitated, half expecting to find another message, another reminder that I wasn't truly alone. The sense of security I had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a chilling awareness that someone out there had slipped into my world, leaving behind nothing but a blank piece of paper and a deep, unshakable fear. Story 5. Here's a revised version of your story, adding a touch of humanization and a stronger horror narrative tone. It was a crisp autumn morning when I stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. The air was sharp, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves. As I bent down to pick up the paper, my eyes caught the edge of an envelope tucked neatly beneath the welcome mat. It was plain, unmarked, and sealed with a strip of tape. I paused, staring at it for a moment. The crispness of the morning suddenly felt heavier, as though the air around me had thickened. Curiosity got the better of me, and I brought the envelope inside, setting it on the kitchen table. The quiet hum of the house felt unusually loud as I tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. My stomach dropped as I pulled it out. The picture was of me. Sitting on the couch. In my living room. I was holding a cup of tea, oblivious to the world around me. The image was crystal clear, but the angle was unmistakable. It had been taken from outside, through the living room window. I froze, staring at the photo. My hands trembled as I glanced out the kitchen window, scanning the yard for any sign of someone nearby. Everything looked normal. The street was quiet, the usual calm of a weekday morning, just a couple of neighbors walking their dogs. I tried to steady my breathing. Maybe it was a prank. A cruel, intrusive joke. But the pit forming in my stomach whispered otherwise. I checked the living room windows, inspecting the locks, peering outside to see if anything seemed out of place. Everything appeared secure, yet the thought of someone being close enough to take that photo made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop wondering how long they had been there. Or worse, if they were still watching. The rest of the day dragged on in a haze of unease. Every creak of the house made me flinch, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. By nightfall, I had locked every door and window and, for the first time in years, drawn the curtains tightly shut. I told myself it was just a precaution, but the house felt suffocatingly quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. I barely slept that night. Shadows seemed to shift outside the window, and I thought I heard faint footsteps on the porch. Every sound became a threat, every moment a test of my sanity. But when morning came, there was no sign of anything unusual. The porch was empty, no new envelopes or signs of trespass. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an isolated, unsettling prank. By evening, I had almost managed to calm my nerves. I made dinner, put on a movie, and settled onto the couch, the same couch from the photograph. Halfway through, a flicker of movement caught my eye. My heart stopped. I turned toward the window, the curtains drawn but not fully closed. For a long moment, I stared at the small gap, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it, a faint shape, barely visible, just beyond the edge of the porch. My chest tightened. Someone was out there, standing motionless in the dark. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? There was nothing concrete, no evidence beyond my mounting fear. Instead, I turned off the lights and stood in the shadows, watching the window, straining to hear any sound. Minutes stretched into an hour. Nothing. Finally, I mustered the courage to check the porch. I opened the door slowly, the night air biting against my skin. The porch was empty. But there it was, another envelope. My breath hitched as I picked it up and stepped back inside, shutting the door with shaky hands. I tore it open, my pulse hammering in my ears. Inside was another photograph. This one was worse. It was me again, standing at the window, peeking through the curtains. The photo had been taken just moments earlier. A wave of nausea washed over me as the realization set in, they had been there the entire time. Watching. Waiting. Panic surged through me. I called the police, trying to explain through trembling words what had happened. They arrived within 20 minutes, their presence a temporary comfort as they searched the property. But once again, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone lingering nearby. One of the officers suggested installing security cameras and keeping the curtains closed. I nodded, but the advice felt hollow. The following days blurred together in a fog of anxiety. I avoided going outside unless absolutely necessary, double-checking every lock, every window. I installed cameras, their blinking red lights both reassuring and unnerving. For a week, nothing happened. The world around me seemed to settle, and I almost began to believe it was over. But one night, just as I was about to go to bed, my phone buzzed. A motion alert. My stomach clenched as I opened the app. The porch camera feed loaded slowly, and then I saw it. A figure, hooded and motionless, standing just outside the door. They didn't knock. They didn't move. They simply stood there, facing the house, as though daring me to come outside. I saved the footage and called the police again, my voice shaking as I described what I had seen. By the time they arrived, the figure was gone. They reviewed the footage, their faces grim but offering little reassurance. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but it wasn't enough. That night, I sat in the dark, glued to the camera feeds, unable to sleep. Whoever they weren't just trying to scare me. They wanted me to know they were there, watching. And I knew, deep down, that they weren't planning to stop. Story 6. It was a quiet evening when I heard a knock at the door. The sound startled me, I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I hesitated, the silence of the house pressing in around me. When I opened the door, a man stood on the threshold. His clothes were worn, his face lined with age, and his eyes carried a weight I couldn't name. "I used to live here," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the words almost lost in the chill evening air. His next sentence, however, struck me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. "But this house, it isn't really yours." I froze, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I managed, my voice uneasy. The man's gaze drifted past me, into the dimly lit hallway behind me. His expression was a strange mix of sorrow and something darker, something that made me instinctively want to close the door. He explained, calmly but firmly, that the house had been in his family for generations, until, he claimed, it was taken from them unfairly. His words didn't make sense. I told him I had bought the house years ago, with paperwork to prove it. He shook his head slowly, his gaze still fixed on something beyond me. "The house has a history," he murmured. "A history no amount of legal documents can erase. Something happened here. Something no one wants to talk about." Against my better judgment, I invited him inside. Partly out of curiosity, partly out of unease at leaving him on the doorstep, I wanted to keep an eye on him. He hesitated at first but eventually stepped inside, his movements deliberate and measured, like someone entering a sacred place. His eyes swept across the foyer as though he were seeing ghosts. He pointed toward the staircase and said, "The third step, it creaks, doesn't it?" My stomach tightened. He was right. He gestured toward the living room next, mentioning a hidden compartment in the floorboards, a feature I had discovered myself shortly after moving in. "How do you know all this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I grew up here," he said simply. Then, as though a dam had broken, he began to speak of his childhood, birthdays, family gatherings, and the fire that had nearly destroyed the house decades ago. I had read about the fire in the property's history, but the way he described it, the smell of smoke, the chaos, the shouting, made it feel immediate, alive. He claimed that not everything had been rebuilt correctly, that there were scars beneath the surface of the house, physical and otherwise. As he spoke, a strange sense of unease settled over me, like the walls themselves were listening. I told him I was sorry for what he had lost, but he interrupted me. "It's not about loss," he said. "It's about truth. This house was never meant to belong to anyone else." His voice grew cryptic, his words circling back to the house's secrets. My unease deepened, and I asked him to leave. But he didn't move. Instead, he locked eyes with me, his gaze unwavering. "You need to check the basement," he said. The air seemed to grow colder. I had always avoided the basement. It was cold, damp, and unsettling, a place I never lingered in for long. "There's something hidden there," he insisted. "Something that will prove everything I've told you." Against every instinct, I led him down the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint flicker of the single overhead bulb cast unsettling shadows on the walls. He stopped in front of a section of the wall, his hand trembling slightly as he pointed. "There," he said. "Remove the paneling." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. But his insistence left me no choice. With trembling hands, I pried off the wooden panels, revealing a hidden space behind the wall. Inside was a rusted metal box, its hinges protesting as I opened it. The contents sent a shiver down my spine, old photographs, letters, and, most disturbingly, a deed to the house. The name on the deed wasn't mine. It wasn't the name of the previous owner, either. It was his. My hands trembled as I examined the papers. They were old, decades old, yet the details matched the house exactly. He explained, his voice thick with emotion, that his family had been forced out after the fire, tricked into signing away their rights to the property. The house had passed from owner to owner, the truth buried beneath layers of time and silence. I didn't know what to believe. The documents seemed genuine, but how could they have remained hidden for so long? And why had he only come forward now? "I spent years searching for this house," he said. "Years chasing its trail through records and whispers. I didn't think I'd ever find it again. I told him I needed time to process everything, to understand what he was telling me. He nodded but lingered, his gaze sweeping the walls one last time, as if saying goodbye to something. Before he left, he gave me one final warning: "Be careful," he said. "This house, it keeps secrets. And not all of them should be uncovered." That night, sleep was impossible. His words echoed in my mind, and every creak and groan of the house felt like a whisper of its hidden past. Over the following days, I began to dig deeper, combing through archives and speaking with local historians. The pieces of the story began to fit together, but with each new detail, my unease grew. The man's family had indeed owned the house, and the fire had been real. But the circumstances of the sale were shrouded in mystery. I tried to find him again, to ask more questions, but he had vanished without a trace, leaving me alone with the weight of his story. The house no longer felt like mine. Its familiar corners and creaky floors seemed imbued with a presence I couldn't ignore. And every night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the house itself was watching, waiting, and holding its secrets just beneath the surface. Story 7. It started on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table, casually cleaning out my wallet, sorting through old receipts and expired coupons. A routine chore, mundane in every way, until I stumbled across something that stopped me cold. A receipt. At first glance, it seemed like any other, a thin slip of paper, faintly crumpled. But as my eyes scanned it, a sense of unease gripped me. It was from a luxury store in a part of town I had never visited. That alone was strange, but the item it listed, a designer watch worth thousands of dollars, made my stomach churn. The date on the receipt was just a week ago, and my name was printed at the top in bold letters. My name. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Surely, this was some mistake. Maybe the receipt had been accidentally slipped into my wallet. But the longer I stared at it, the less plausible that seemed. Panic began to creep in. I opened my banking app and scoured my account for any signs of the charge. To my relief, there was nothing out of the ordinary, no suspicious transactions, no missing money. Just groceries, bills, and the usual small expenses. But if my card hadn't been used, then where had this receipt come from? I decided to call the store, hoping for an explanation. After a few rings, a polite woman answered. I explained the situation, my voice trembling slightly, and asked if they could check their records for a purchase under my name. She put me on hold, and every second felt like an eternity. When she came back, her voice was calm, but her words sent an icy chill through me. Yes, she said. The purchase was made and picked up in person. I gripped the phone tighter. By who? Her response made my blood run cold. It was, you. Or someone who looked exactly like you. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling uncontrollably. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been to that store. I hadn't bought anything like that. The idea that someone might be impersonating me was terrifying enough, but why would they leave a receipt where I'd find it? That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house sounded amplified, every shadow seemed to loom with intent. The receipt was no longer just a scrap of paper, it was a harbinger of something dark and unexplainable. The next morning, I turned my attention back to my wallet, combing through it for any other anomalies. That's when I found it, a small, plain card tucked into a pocket I rarely used. No logos. No markings. Just a handwritten message scrawled in uneven ink, "Keep it safe." My heart pounded as I read the words, over and over. The message made no sense. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I had no idea how the card had ended up in my wallet. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the store in person. The sleek glass doors and immaculate displays made me feel like an imposter. A sales associate approached, all warmth and professionalism, and I showed them the receipt. Their brow furrowed as I explained the situation, but they agreed to check their records. Moments later, they brought out security footage. I watched the screen intently. There I was, or someone who looked exactly like me. The person on the tape had my face, my voice, even my mannerisms. They smiled, chatted with the cashier, handed over a card, and walked out with the watch. It was me. But it wasn't me. I left the store in a daze, every step feeling heavier than the last. The idea that someone could not only impersonate me but do it so flawlessly, it was beyond unsettling. That night, I scoured my home, desperate to find some clue, some explanation. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, in the corner of my closet, I found it. A box I didn't recognize, tucked beneath a pile of old clothes. My hands shook as I pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside was the watch from the receipt, gleaming under the dim light of my bedroom. Beneath it lay another note, written in the same haunting handwriting as the card. "You'll need this soon." My breath caught in my throat. The cryptic message only deepened the dread coiling in my chest. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Every time I stepped outside, I was certain someone was following me. I would spin around, my heart pounding, but the street was always empty. The watch remained on my kitchen counter, a constant, oppressive presence. I thought about throwing it away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Deep down, I felt the note was right, I would need it. For what, I didn't know. Weeks passed, and the mystery grew heavier, like a storm cloud hanging over my life. The receipt, the watch, the notes, they were pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I didn't know who was behind it, or why. All I knew was that my life had shifted into something unrecognizable. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Not yet. Story 8. When the new neighbors moved in, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The house next door had been empty for months, its silence an unsettling void in our usually lively neighborhood. They seemed like the perfect family, a kind couple with two cheerful kids who smiled and waved every time we crossed paths. On their first day, I even helped them carry a few boxes inside, feeling a renewed sense of community that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. At first, everything felt normal, almost idyllic. Their lights came on at predictable hours, the kids played in the yard, and the parents occasionally chatted with other neighbors. The house, once lifeless, brought a warmth to the street that felt comforting. Sometimes, I'd catch one of them standing by a window, looking out toward the street. I'd wave, and they'd always wave back, polite and friendly. But then, things began to change. One night, I came home late from work and noticed a light on in their living room. The father was standing at the window, staring out at the street. I waved instinctively, but he didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. I figured he hadn't seen me, but the next morning, when I casually mentioned it to the mother, she laughed lightly and said they'd been at her sister's house all evening. It must have been a mistake, I told myself. Maybe I'd seen something else. But it kept happening. A few nights later, as I was taking out the trash, I glanced up at their house and saw the mother's face in the upstairs window. Her expression was unerringly blank, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. When I asked her the next day if everything was all right, she smiled warmly, thanking me for my concern but insisting they hadn't been home that night either. It didn't make sense. The sightings became more frequent. Sometimes it was the father, sometimes the mother, and sometimes one of the kids. Always standing at the windows, always staring, not just at the street, but at me. Their faces were disturbingly still, their eyes tracking me as I walked past. I stopped mentioning it to them, afraid I'd sound paranoid or intrusive. But the unease grew, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't remove. One weekend, they told me they'd be out of town for a few days, visiting relatives. That night, as I settled onto my couch, I glanced at their house out of habit. My heart froze. There he was, the father, standing in the upstairs window, staring directly at my house. The room behind him was dark, save for the faint light that framed his silhouette. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call someone. But when I looked back, the light was off, and the window was empty. The next day, I decided to investigate. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the growing dread. Pretending to check my mailbox, I wandered close to their house and peered through the windows. Everything was dark and empty, just as they'd said it would be. But the memory of that face burned in my mind. After that, the situation spiraled. Late at night, I began hearing noises from their property, soft creaks, whispers that seemed to carry on the wind. Every time I looked out my window, I felt like I was being watched. The faces in their windows weren't confined to their house anymore. I started seeing them in reflections, in my car's rearview mirror, in the glass of my kitchen door. Always watching. One night, I woke to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I sat up, staring at the shadowy outline of the glass. The tapping continued, soft but insistent. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pulled back the curtain. No one was there. But across the street, every window of their house glowed faintly. Behind the glass, the entire family stood motionless, their faces eerily still. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called a friend, desperate for company. As we sat on my porch, I told her everything. I expected her to laugh or dismiss my story, but instead, her face went pale. She pointed toward the house. "They're watching us," she whispered. I turned. They were there again, all four of them, their blank faces pressed against the windows. My friend left in a hurry, refusing to stay another minute. I couldn't blame her. I tried calling the neighbors, but their phone went straight to voicemail. When they returned a few days later, they acted like everything was normal, chatting about their trip and asking how I'd been. I didn't have the nerve to confront them. I couldn't stay there anymore. As I packed my belongings, I avoided looking at their house, afraid of what I might see. But as I loaded the last box into my car and turned to lock my door, I couldn't resist one final glance. Every window in their house was dark. But I could feel their eyes on me. Story 9. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that blurs into the background of a busy life. I had spent most of it running errands and catching up with friends over coffee, returning home expecting nothing more than a few missed calls, work, family, the usual. But as I scrolled through my notifications, one voicemail caught my eye. The number was unfamiliar, and the timestamp read 3:15 p.m. Something about it made me pause. Curiosity, or maybe some deeper instinct, led me to press play. What came through the speaker chilled me to my core. The voice was mine, undeniably mine, but it sounded wrong, distorted with urgency and a raw, panicked edge I'd never heard before. "Listen to me carefully," it began, the words clipped, almost frantic. "Something terrible is going to happen at 3 p.m. today. You need to stop it. Do not ignore this warning." My stomach clenched as the message continued, delivering fragmented instructions that felt both urgent and incomprehensible, as if the version of me speaking was struggling to form coherent sentences. I glanced at the clock, 3:20 p.m. My pulse quickened as a horrifying realization set in. How could I have received a message from myself, warning me about something that had already passed? I replayed the voicemail, hanging on to every strained word. "Don't trust anyone at the meeting. If you go, it will be too late. They know. You're not safe. Please, listen to me. I'm begging you." The voice grew more desperate, cracking under the weight of fear. In the background, I could hear faint noises, a crowded street, distant voices, the chaotic bustle of some urgent moment. My chest tightened as I sat frozen, the phone trembling in my hand. At exactly 3 p.m., I had been scheduled for a critical meeting. A potential client. A deal that could reshape my career. But now, I couldn't shake the dissonant echoes of my own voice warning me to stay away. Was this some sick prank? A glitch? Or something far darker, far stranger. I opened my calendar, staring at the meeting details as dread seeped into my veins. The clock ticked louder in my ears. Canceling felt absurd, but what if I didn't? What if the warning was real? I dialed my assistant, my voice trembling as I asked her to reschedule the meeting. Personal reasons, I mumbled, barely able to mask the fear in my tone. She sounded confused but didn't press further. The moment I hung up, relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The gnawing unease didn't fade. The house felt suffocatingly quiet, yet I couldn't escape the creeping sensation of being watched. Hours dragged by, each second stretching longer than the last. I tried to bury myself in work, but my mind refused to let go of the voicemail. Over and over, I replayed it in my head, dissecting every word, every inflection. Then, at 3 p.m., an eerie sense of déjà vu hit me like a physical blow. It was as if I were standing at the edge of a moment I couldn't quite grasp, teetering between two versions of reality. I stared at the clock, wondering if I'd made a mistake by canceling. Perhaps I had altered the course of my day unnecessarily. The world outside seemed untouched, normal. Until the notification came. My phone buzzed violently in my hand, and a news alert flashed across the screen, major accident reported at downtown office building. My heart sank. It was the building. The one where my meeting had been scheduled. Fingers trembling, I opened the article. The words blurred as I read about a horrific elevator malfunction at precisely 3 p.m. Several people were trapped, the injuries were severe. The blood drained from my face as I tried to steady my breathing. The warning had been real. I had narrowly escaped being in that building at the exact moment disaster struck. But how? I stared at my phone, replaying the voicemail yet again. The voice was mine. The message was specific. The panic, the desperation, it was all too real. Had I sent this to myself? From the future? Or had something else intervened, bending time and reality to deliver the warning? The questions circled my mind like vultures, tearing at my sense of logic. What terrified me most wasn't just the possibility that I had avoided death or injury, but the gnawing certainty that this was only the beginning. As the hours stretched into night, the weight of the experience settled over me, heavy and suffocating. My life had been irrevocably altered by that voicemail. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice, my voice, would call again. Story 10. The evening air carried a crisp coolness as I stepped outside, the world bathed in the fading glow of the setting sun. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the soft rustle of leaves filled the quiet streets. I had walked this path countless times, finding peace in its familiarity, but tonight was different. There was something wrong. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the night itself was holding its breath. As I rounded a corner, I saw him. At the edge of the street, just beyond the flickering light of a street lamp, stood a man. His posture was unnervingly rigid, like he was carved from stone, his body completely still. The dim light played tricks on his face, obscuring most of it, but I could feel his gaze. It was as though his eyes were drilling into me, pulling at my very soul. I slowed my steps, unsure of what to do. The street was empty, eerily quiet, and the houses nearby were dark, lifeless. A shiver crawled up my spine. A part of me wanted to turn back, to hurry home and pretend nothing had happened. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. Gathering what little courage I had, I continued walking, pretending not to notice him. But when I glanced back, he was gone. The streetlight flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows across the pavement. My chest tightened, a knot of fear forming in my stomach. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The feeling of his presence still clung to the air like a thick fog, oppressive and suffocating. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The street seemed impossibly long, stretching out before me as if mocking my desire to escape. The more I walked, the more the sense of unease grew. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the overwhelming urge to glance behind me. But then I heard it, a voice. At first, it was faint, almost like a murmur, a whisper I could barely hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. It seemed to come from inside my head, distant and disembodied. As it grew louder, the words became clearer, though they made no sense. The voice was calm, deep, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent to it, a sharpness that cut through my thoughts and sent chills down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, my hands pressing to my ears, hoping to block it out. But it didn't help. The voice kept coming, its murmurs relentless, speaking of things I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. It felt as though it was pulling at the deepest parts of my mind, stirring up memories I had long buried. The voice wasn't coming from around me. It was coming from within me. Panic surged through my body, my legs trembling as I tried to control my breathing. I started walking again, faster now, desperate to escape the voice that seemed to follow me with each step. It grew louder, more insistent, and the words began to feel like they were probing into my thoughts, unraveling memories I wasn't ready to confront. I stumbled, my foot catching on a crack in the sidewalk, and barely managed to catch myself before falling. I veered off the path and into a small park, hoping the open space would calm my nerves. The trees loomed overhead, their branches stretching like twisted fingers into the dark sky, casting strange and shifting shadows on the ground. For a brief moment, the voice quieted, and I dared to hope that it was gone. But as I passed a cluster of benches, I saw him again. He was sitting on one of the benches, his posture as rigid as before. His face was now clearer, illuminated by the soft light of a nearby lamp. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, though I couldn't place it. I froze, my legs locked in place, unable to move or look away. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a single motion. But his presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The air around me thickened, as if the very atmosphere was charged with his presence. The voice in my head returned, louder and more urgent this time, repeating a single phrase over and over again. I couldn't understand it, but I couldn't ignore it either. It was as though the words were scraping at the edges of my mind, urging me to understand something that I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the ground as if some invisible force held me in place. Then, slowly, the man stood. His movements were deliberate, controlled. He took a step toward me, then another, each one seeming to stretch out impossibly long, echoing through the night in an unnatural way. Finally, my paralysis broke. My body lurched into motion, and I turned to run. My feet pounded the pavement as I fled, not daring to look back. The voice, however, did not fade. It followed me, growing louder, drowning out the sound of my own footsteps. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The street seemed to stretch on forever, each step dragging me further into the night. My lungs burned with each breath, and my heart thudded in my chest. When I reached the edge of the park, I paused, gasping for air. The street ahead was dark and empty. The houses loomed like silent sentinels, their windows cold and unwelcoming. I glanced back, expecting to see him, but there was nothing. The park was unnervingly quiet. I made it home, the door clicking shut behind me, but the feeling of being watched never left. I checked every window and lock, making sure everything was secure. The voice was gone, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I could still feel his presence, lingering in the air. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. Who was he? Why had his voice been inside my head? Over the next few days, I avoided going outside, too afraid to leave the safety of my home. But the voice returned. This time, it came in whispers during the dead of night, quieter but always there, like a distant memory that I couldn't escape. It spoke of things I didn't understand, things I didn't want to understand. And as time passed, I began noticing other strange occurrences, objects in my house shifting slightly, as if moved when I wasn't looking. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, only to disappear when I turned my head. The air felt thicker, heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. One evening, I found a note on my doorstep. It was written in a handwriting I didn't recognize, but the words made my blood run cold. "You saw me, and now I see you." My hands trembled as I read the note, the voice in my head echoing those same chilling words. "I don't know what's happening to me or how to stop it. The man hasn't appeared again, but his presence is everywhere. The voice is a constant companion, always whispering, always watching. I can't escape. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, he is always one step ahead. And even now, as I sit here, writing this, I can feel his eyes on me, the voice urging me to understand something I can't grasp. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I just want it to end."